Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Death of Death podcast, where we proclaim Christ's victory over sin, death, and everything else. I'm your host, as always, Nick Stewart. How's it going? Are you making it through? Are you okay? Are you, you're probably alive if you're listening to this, but are you living? Are you living? I just want to check in on you guys. I care about you. Something about having a video podcast makes me feel more connected to you than I ever have been. So I just want to check in and make sure you guys are okay. Make sure you're, something about this angle shows me how bad my posture is. So I always sit up a little bit when I see that camera. All right. There's not a lot to get to before we start the show today. So I'm just going to jump in. We are going to be talking about the Deconstruction Movement. Not really sure what to call it. It kind of is a movement. There's just been a lot of high-profile Christians that have seemingly left the faith in recent years and, have kind of deconstructed their beliefs, where they've kind of, just kind of started over and just kind of started at, the baseline of what they believe and tried to build on from there. And we're going to talk about kind of the methodological problems of that a little bit. I don't want to get too specific with certain people, but there are certain people where it helps to actually look at what they've said about their story to kind of piece together, kind of where, what thought process may have led to this sort of thing, and what state of their heart might have been, present in such a change, based solely on their statements alone. It's just interesting to look into what they say for themselves. So I'm going to try to, not be too specific, but there's a few people we're going to have to talk about because, there's a giant elephant in the room, and the weirdest thing that I could do is pretend that it's not there. So, it's just very popular. It's something that's been happening a lot. It just seems like 2 or 3 at least a year, 2 or 3 high-profile people like Josh Harris or Dustin Kensrue or, people like that just kind of come out and say, either I'm not a Christian anymore, or I'm having, I'm adding beliefs to my system that are very, very not Christian, and or I'm giving up a lot of traditional Christian ideas. It runs the gamut. It's very different for each person, so it doesn't it doesn't help to kind of say that this is how it is in every single case, but it does help to look into a few certain people to kind of examine what might have been going on there, and we can speculate a little bit. It's public stuff, it's public information, but I don't want to pretend to speak for them or to, pretend that I know exactly what's going on in their head. I can only interpret what they've said, So, I think the most obvious one is Dustin Kensrue, because he has seemingly kind of remained in Christian culture, despite having had this deconstruction period in his life. And, I haven't really checked in on his podcast in a while, so I don't really know where he stands today. It seems like that was kind of an ever-evolving thing for him. So, I can talk about what I've heard him say, but, mostly I heard him talk about the kind of beginning of his deconstruction journey and not so much, where he lands today. But, I think he's helpful because I paid closer attention to his story than Josh Harris or Paul Maxwell or any of these people. So, just for the sake of analyzing the situation, I think it would help to go over, some of the things that he said and kind of his story. And again, these are basically, he did 2 podcasts that were kind of the most groundbreaking when it came to this event in his life, if you want to call it that. He was on a music podcast called Lead Singer Syndrome, and that was where he first, as far as I know, that was the first public declaration that he did not believe in the inerrancy of Scripture any longer. If there was something out before then I'm not really aware of it. But that's the thing that blew up in my circles with people I knew. That's what people started talking about. And then the other one, he was on the Bad Christian podcast, where he kind of gave like a more in-depth story of his whole kind of experience, and like starting to doubt things, starting to, believe some non-traditional things, and then just kind of jumping in headfirst into deconstruction. So the first one, he mentioned something that was eerily similar to another like a deconversion story, not just a deconstruction story, which I think there's a difference. He mentioned being on tour and, just meeting so many different people and being in so many different cultures and so many different belief systems. And, this kind of inability to accept that like these people were wrong, or that they were going to hell, or like whatever the thing is, he started to doubt whether he had everything figured out, because people all over the world seemed perfectly fine and happy and good. Now, that's a massive paraphrase, so don't put quotes in that and put Dustin Kensrue's name at the end. But that was kind of the idea he was getting at. And Mike Herrera from MXPX, who is no longer a Christian, he is an agnostic now by his own admission, said pretty much the exact same thing. He considered himself a Christian at one point, and then he went on tour a lot and met so many people, met so many great folks, and he couldn't really justify his beliefs anymore from that point on, because it would mean that all of these people were wrong, all these people were going to hell, all these people were, bad people. And, that's kind of the basis of Christianity, is that everyone's bad and everyone needs a savior. So there's already kind of a confusion of Christian beliefs going into this kind of thing. Not to say that was Dustin's position necessarily, but when he told his more in-depth story on the Bad Christian podcast, he was talking about, he started out struggling with the Doctrine of Hell. And that's one that I've wavered on quite a bit between the traditional view and a more annihilationist kind of view. And I'm no longer weary of saying that. There were many years where I was a pretty convinced annihilationist, and I did not want to say it publicly because I was associated with a lot of organizations that were not going to be okay with that. And so the reason I'm more comfortable saying it now is because I'm not convinced one way or the other. Like, I'm pretty agnostic on whether hell lasts forever or whether it's just a really long time. Like, to me, it's not a huge difference. So, that's a conversation for another day. But, he said that was one of his first, kind of doubts, his first questioning of Christian tradition and stuff. And so then he said that he got the book, The 5 Views on Biblical Inerrancy, and that he was reading it on tour, and one of the views that was not the traditional like Chicago statement view, one of those views made a lot of sense to him, and the vibe of what I got from him was like, this was putting into words what I kind of believed, but I didn't know how to articulate it, like it just made a lot more sense to me. And so from that point on, he didn't believe the Bible was inerrant anymore. And now he didn't get into specifics about what his view was, but I'm guessing, because he was still calling himself a Christian, I'm guessing that his position was the Bible is not inerrant in everything, but the main things, which is like the gospel and God, like those things we can trust. But as far as like what day Jesus was crucified on or how many times the rooster crowed, like, yeah, well, that doesn't matter. It's probably, there's probably errors in some of those things. Well, my only problem with that, which again, kind of a separate conversation, but my problem with that is that I have no way of knowing whether, the Bible's portrayal of God or the plan of redemption, the plan of salvation that Christ accomplished. I have no idea if that's true if I can't trust the smaller details as well. Like if it's wrong about how many times the rooster crowed, could be wrong about the gospel, like how would you know? There would be no way of knowing. And that's why biblical inerrancy is really important, especially in the Reformed view, because it is kind of the basis of everything. Like without a Bible you can trust 100%, you can't know any of this stuff really. And, I know some people who don't hold too strict biblical inerrancy and they still believe all the same stuff that I do. I mean, they're Trinitarians. They believe in the gospel. They believe in the resurrection. They believe in all that stuff. So I know it doesn't always end up in a, faithless position, or it doesn't always end up in an unbelieving position. I'm not trying to say that you have to believe in the Chicago statement of biblical inerrancy in order to be a Christian. I'm just saying it's at the very top of a very slippery slope that tends to go one way. Sometimes it takes longer than others, but so it's always kind of an illogical, weird position for me to think that like the Bible could be trustworthy on the more miraculous, like outlandish things, if you want to call it that, like the resurrection, but it couldn't really be trusted on like whether Jesus fed the 4,000 by multiplying the food, so it's stuff like that. So, whatever his view was, if he still considered himself a Christian, which he claims to have, at that time, I don't know where he stands now, but at the time he was still considering himself a Christian. So I'm sure it was a view like that. It had to be a view kind of like that because, you wouldn't be a Christian by any meaningful sense of the word if you just believed nothing in the Bible. You said the entire Bible is fiction and nonsense. I do know of some people who do that. Jack Grisham from the punk band TSOL, he's become like a big like motivational speaker and like a big guy in like 12-step programs and stuff. And he's become a pretty accomplished writer as well. I used to watch his video blogs, which dates me quite a bit, but he would do these long rambling like video journals on YouTube like 11 or 10 years ago, and he would say quite often, I consider myself a Christian even though I don't believe Jesus ever existed as a person. He said, I hold to the teachings of Christ. And by that, he meant, being good to your neighbor and not stealing, the 10 Commandments and stuff like that. He meant that, but Jesus taught that he was God. So, you definitely don't hold to all of the teachings of Christ if you don't believe that the Bible's true. So, it's kind of a weird position, but I get how people end up there. So it's not like, you're damned for having questions or that, you're damned for having a moment of weakness in your logic, whatever, but things seem to escalate from there. His tweets got a little weird, but I can't really remember what he was saying. It just got kind of increasingly more unchristian in a lot of ways. And then, I was listening to his podcast whenever there was someone who interested me, and I love Bad Religion, and Brett Gurewitz from Bad Religion was on his podcast, and it was a really good episode, especially if you like Bad Religion. But toward the end of the podcast, they did talk about religion a little bit. They talked about Christianity a little bit. I don't remember if Dustin talked about like his deconstruction at all, but they broached the topic of Christianity, and Dustin mentioned that the God of the Old Testament was kind of an asshole. And all right, so I mean we're getting pretty far away from anything that could like meaningfully be called Christianity at that point. it's actually kind of a really weird claim, even though you hear it a lot from atheists and stuff, because basically you're going to kind of fall into one of two camps. If you're a Christian, you're going to fall into one of two camps. You're going to say either all the stuff in the Old Testament happened and I can explain God's holiness and his sovereignty and our sinfulness in a way that makes it okay. That's the position that I'm in. I believe I would go the R.C. Sproul holiness of God route with that and explain, look, if you're having any problem with the way God treats people, you've got way too high a view of people and way too low a view of God. So that's, more the Reformed traditional kind of way of going about it. And then there's more the liberal way where we kind of interpret those things away. So, God didn't really kill all those people because, that God wouldn't do that, So based on our New Testament reading, we can kind of read back into it that must have been figurative, or it didn't really mean what we think it means, or it's just an allegorical story, didn't really happen, But the weirdest thing is to say these things happened and God is an asshole for doing that. That's weird. That doesn't resemble any kind of Christianity that I know of. So I'm not trying to make a claim on Dustin Kensrue's soul. It just seems to me, by following the progression, seems like it kind of got increasingly more unchristian as he went along. But I'm not making any sort of a statement on where he's at now. For all I know, he's had some massive return to, Reformed theology, and he's, back to his old self. But so that's kind of an interesting look at like where the doubts started, where the questions started, and how they weren't really dealt with very well. It didn't sound like he had a pastor in his life kind of guiding him through some of those questions, or if he did, he was not receptive to it. Again, don't know much about that personal situation either. I know what church he was in when it happened. It's a little hard for me to believe he wasn't getting his questions answered based on what I know of that church. But, again, that's why you don't want to get too specific, because I'm starting to kind of mouth off about things I don't necessarily know about. But, the purpose of the show is to talk about deconstruction and to learn what we can about it and kind of analyze some of the stories we know to kind of try to piece together how some of this stuff happened. And I don't have any qualms about that. But I was a little apprehensive to get into certain people's stories because I knew, I wouldn't be able to not speculate outside of what I know for sure to be true. So we're going to leave Dustin's story right there. And I want to get into a little bit of how I think this happens. And so there's basically two kinds of pressure, and I believe it is mainly pressure. It's pressure mainly that leads you to start questioning or doubting things. And I think it's two specific kinds of pressure. I think it's social pressure and inner pressure. And by social pressure, I don't mean that like the football player wants you to smoke cigarettes and so you start smoking cigarettes. I don't mean like peer pressure. I mean any sort of pressure that comes about because of your relationships with people. And so we see that kind of in the problems with hell. We don't want to believe that other people might burn in hell for eternity or be punished at all. Even in annihilationism, there's no, clear-cut position on like whether hell, is punishment or you do just cease to exist after you die. Like there's variation on that stuff too. And so a lot of this comes from not liking the idea that your fellow image bearers of God are going to burn in any, even if it's temporary. And that's totally understandable. I'd be a little weirded out if you never, if you never sweat over that, if you never have a problem with that, if you never have questions about that, you could be a psychopath. But, hell's one. Gay marriage is a big one. I think that pressure is more shifting into the more like woke critical race theory stuff now, because that's just kind of where the cultural outrage is kind of going. But, a long time ago, it was like, well, I don't want to tell my gay friend that, I don't believe that he should be getting married, or that I think homosexuality is wrong. Like, he loves his husband, or his boyfriend, whatever. Like, I'm kind of speaking from personal experience. Like, I've had gay friends. I've had gay friends whose boyfriends I've met, and I've liked the boyfriends too and wanted to hang out with those guys, So it's hard for me as well. I'm not talking, out of my realm of experience here. And that's kind of another conversation for another time. We could talk about that, but so that's another thing. I start to, well, not me, but people might start to doubt the validity of the Bible because it says things about homosexuality that they can't really reconcile with the gay people that they know personally. And, okay, there's a certain amount of sense to be made out of that. But that doesn't mean that you get to just cast the Bible aside. Oh, hey, look, it's Sabbath. This is my cat, Sabbath. The black creature of the night. Say hi, Sabbath. All right, go play. You don't get to just cast the Bible aside and start from some other standard, because that wouldn't make sense. Only the Bible is 100% true standard. So, when you start, if you make yourself your standard, your own reasoning, your standard, or your own experience, your standard, then, you're no different than the atheists and all the other religions. And, so like what does set your reasoning apart from all the people who disagree with you? 100% true, trustworthy source, right from the mouth of God, outside of myself, not subject to error. That's a pretty good standard to have. So, I understand the questions. I understand the doubts. I get it. But the reaction to that cannot be to reject the only good standard and go with something else because you don't like it. And then another one, like we saw from Mike Herrera, Sabbath. Really, dude. I'm trying to do a show here, Sabbath. You're being very unprofessional. Maybe I can just hold Sabby for a while. This is weird for you to watch a man with a cat talk about hell and gay people. But, another thing was, Mike Herrera and Dustin Kensrue both said something to the effect of like meeting so many different cultures that it became hard for them to accept that they were wrong, or that they were, misled or going to hell or whatever, So that's the kind of social pressure I'm talking about when I say that. I just mean any sort of pressure that's coming from people, your beliefs about people, your experience with people, your relationships with people, like any of that that's starting to influence your view, your worldview, and your view of the Bible, and your view of religion, Christianity, all that. That's what I mean by social pressure. The other kind of pressure is inner pressure. And now this comes about in a whole myriad of ways, but I've thought of a few key ones to look out for. Is being a false convert, and that's rough. And I don't really want to say that. But, we could be talking some of these people. I'm not making a judgment here. I'm not making a 100% clear statement. Or judgment on where their eternal soul is going to end up. But, if we talk about Paul Maxwell, Josh Harris, Dustin Kensrue, Rhett and Link, all these different people who have deconstructed or deconverted or like aren't Christians anymore, however they say it, all of these people are probably in much different headspaces. They have different reasons that they left the faith, seemingly, whatever. We'll talk about the doctrinal problems with that later, but some of them statistically have to be false converts. And I'm not saying who, because I don't know. I'm not saying Paul Maxwell's never been a Christian. I have no idea. I don't believe you can lose your salvation. Spoiler alert. So I don't know what to think. But it's improbable that all of these people were true Christians and are just in a momentary lapse of judgment, and God is preserving them through a time of ignorance. I hope that's true for all of them. I doubt it's true for most of them. So, here we are. That could be one of the ways that, that this could have happened. You were never truly converted. And now, you're trying to live like a Christian, which if you're not converted, living like a Christian just means following certain rules and having, a routine for your daily Bible reading and like knowing things about theology, just having head knowledge. And if you're just trying to live that way, even though you're not converted and you do not have the Spirit dwelling in you, that's hard. And so like we see in the Paul Maxwell video, again, not saying he was never a Christian, but I'm just positing something. He said in his video, he was crying. He was crying in his video where he said he's not a Christian anymore. And he said he's so relieved. And one of the reasons that you could be super relieved after leaving Christianity is because you were never converted and you were just kind of putting on airs. You were just sort of, walking through the motions and not really believing. And that's got to be tough for a long time. That's got to be really tough. So it would make sense if someone was relieved after finally getting out of a situation where they were pretending to be someone who they're not. And then another one is a love for sin. And this is typically where we see people not really falling away from the faith, but God preserving them through a time of ignorance, loving sin so much that you cannot give it up, and it hardens your heart to the point where you start to kind of question the Bible, where it's like, well, I love drugs or porn or whatever it is so much that I'm just going to kind of step away from the church and I'm just, gonna have my thing that I love, whatever it is. Maybe it's socialism. Just kidding. Why do I say things like that? See, I'm making enemies. I'm making enemies when I say things like that. But yeah, so this love for sin, we know love for sin creates a hardness of the heart. Romans 1 says that. And so that hardness of the heart could lead you to cast off Christianity, leave the church, all that stuff. Typically, this is more in line with someone who's being preserved and will come back to the fold. Although sometimes this is just an evidence of someone who never was saved. But dangerous to make a conclusion on it because the day's not over yet. They're not dead yet. So it's hard to say what God's doing through this. But I think Paul is pretty, clear in how we treat Christians in our churches who are in that state. I think it's pretty clear to treat them as unbelievers and, excommunicate them from the fellowship in certain cases. Another podcast for another time. I should start writing these down so I can actually do some of these podcasts that I say I'll do someday. But yeah, so that's kind of it. Either just pretending to be a Christian when you're not, or loving sin so much that your heart becomes hardened, are two of the ways that this inner pressure kind of leads you to deconverting or deconstructing or trying to find another way of explaining the Bible, sometimes leaving the faith altogether. Well, like I said, I think that starting with anything besides the Bible does not make sense. So to me, it doesn't make sense to deconstruct all the way down to where you don't even have the Bible anymore and then just sort of start with your own reason. Again, I would ask, what's the difference between you and the atheist? The atheist starts with his own reason. So, if he's coming to a different conclusion than you, then, your own reason is clearly not infallible. It's clearly, prone to error, So, we don't know if these people will come back to the faith at some point. And I think that's kind of the determining factor. I would say if all the people we mentioned today, for those who have said that they've left Christianity, they're not Christians anymore, like Josh Harris and Paul Maxwell specifically, if those guys live the rest of their lives and they die at a ripe old age and never repent and never come back to the fold, then I think we could say that they were never Christians. But if in 5 years they come back stronger than ever and they say, I tried to give it up and I couldn't because God just had a hold of me and he brought me back into the fold. I think it's safe to say they were saved and God preserved them, you know? And so, I have kind of a deconstruction story a bit, but it took me in the very opposite direction that these other guys have gone. I grew up in a Calvary chapel that was really legalistic and had pretty bad theology. And when I discovered Calvinism, I realized, I kind of had this feeling like I'd been lied to my whole life, and I'm actually doing a little bit of writing about this. This should be out in a blog post pretty soon. Hopefully it's out before you even see this, but it might be out, a little later. But, a friend of mine introduced me to Calvinism and I, it just made so much sense to me that I jumped in head first and kind of started looking at my church like, you were holding out on me. Like, you didn't, you kept me from knowing these things and, called it a cult and all this stuff. And now I see that this is the truth. Like, this is the Bible, So, like, I kind of feel like you were lying to me, and I kind of feel like you've been holding out on me. And so I did have this moment when I first became a Calvinist where I kind of had to drop everything I knew about Christianity and just start over. And but the difference was that I started with the Bible. Instead of my entire foundation being what my church taught me, the Bible said, I went to the Bible itself, and I went to good teachers like R.C. Sproul, and that's where I built my foundation up from. And so I, went more orthodox in my deconstruction than some of these other people that we've talked about. And so I don't want to say that deconstruction is necessarily bad, because sometimes it takes you in a better direction. Sometimes deconstructing the building is a good thing as long as you reconstruct on the proper foundation. We should not reject cage stagers, It's what we call the angry new Calvinists who are, they're brand new Calvinists, and so they're fighting about it with everyone. Like, we shouldn't reject those people because they've gone through a trauma. Jim Jeffries, the stand-up comedian, talked about when he first became an atheist, he refused to go to his friend's wedding because he refused to step foot in a church. And he said, when you first become an atheist, you do irrational things like that because you feel like you've been lied to your whole life. And, and it reminded me of cage stage Calvinists. It's like, yeah, you feel kind of betrayed, or, you feel like you've got something that the whole world needs to know about, so you're going to be a little ridiculous about it at first. And so we need to not be casting these people off and, like, kicking them out of our Bible studies and stuff. That's just a side note, But, I kind of had I've had many deconstructions, I've like the annihilationism thing, not that I really want to bring that up again, but, when I became a pretty convinced annihilationist, and then I had to reckon with this logical problem of that if I was correct, church history is not absent of annihilationists, John Stott, F.F. Bruce, like, there's some pretty good ones. But if I was correct, then the history of the church overwhelmingly, especially like Protestants, indwelt by the same Holy Spirit that I am, the majority of church history came to a different conclusion than I did. And that became a pretty big problem for me. And that's where I kind of was led to just say, you know what? I don't know, but I'll fall back on the London Baptist Confession right here. This is a tried and true, doctrinal system. I am a Reformed Baptist. When I don't know, because my logic is leading me somewhere where I don't necessarily know if I'm right, this is a good thing to just, so I go to the chapter about, what is it? It's the end of man and the state after death, I think it's called. What's the contents? The state of man after death and the resurrection of the dead. It's chapter 31, the London Baptist Confession. So when you don't know, you can fall back on that and say, you know what, I don't know, but a lot of great people in the faith with the same Holy Spirit that I have interpreted it this way, So I am a little agnostic on the issue of hell. I I believe there is a punishment for sinners after death. I believe that punishment is eternal. The only thing I'm not sure about is whether the punishing is eternal. And that's all I can, I know I don't want anyone to go to hell. That's what I do know. I don't want anyone to cease to exist. I don't want anyone to burn for eternity. I don't want, in Paul Washer's messed up view of heaven, I don't want, to be laughing at them in hell for all eternity and like joyously, throwing gasoline on them, whatever his weird thing was. Probably shouldn't just bring that up without clear citations. Make him sound like a psycho. But yeah, so it's just like, again, had a little deconstruction, and it led me in an even more orthodox direction than I had previously been. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And that's why, I'm not a fan of where some of these people have ended up doctrinally, especially if they're outright saying they're not Christians. But let's not give up on them. Let's not give up on Paul Maxwell and say, okay, he's not a Christian. Screw that guy. Let's be done with him. Let's not give up on Dustin Kensrue and say, like, okay, he's a libtard now. Like, okay, he's, he doesn't believe in inerrancy. He's a universalist. He's supporting Bernie Sanders. Like, all right, screw that guy. That's not the way to go about it. Especially if God is preserving them, like I said, through a time of ignorance and is going to bring them back to, stronger than they were before, boy, will your face be red when, you look back on the way that you acted toward them when God was doing something in them, So don't give up. And, I've had my moments of frustration with some high-profile Christians that I really liked that deconverted or deconstructed. Like, I've had my moments, but I've tried not to, cast them aside like they're not people anymore, So that's kind of where, that's all I got for today, So I guess let me know if you have any deconstruction stories. You've probably come out of a deconstruction if you listen to this podcast. I doubt you're, highly entrenched in liberal theology if you're listening to me, but if you have any experience with that, I want to hear it. You can email that to contact@deathofdeath.net, and I'll interact with it on the show if it's something that helps further this conversation along. So yeah, that's all I got. Go to the store to buy some t-shirts and some stickers. Sign up for the Patreon if you haven't yet. If you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, even if you're listening on the audio podcast, just go subscribe. It's going to help out the numbers. I'm trying to build up the YouTube channel. That's kind of where I want the show to find its home from now on, for as long as I'm allowed to do it, because pretty much anyone with anything bad to say about the COVID cult is getting kicked off of there. So I probably won't last long, but you know what? Let's give it the old college try and try to make it on there. I think that's all I got. I created a Linktree account for myself and for the Death of Death. So if you go to my Instagram, Nick C. Stewart, @NickCStewart, you know how it is. The link in my profile will now, instead of taking you to one link, will take you to a page with buttons for all of my stuff. So you can get to all the Death of Death stuff from there. There's podcast app buttons on there that you can click for your preferred podcast. And then I made one for Death of Death as well. So the Death of Death Instagram has all the Death of Death stuff, the store, the Patreon, all of it. So go check that out. If you need links to anything, you can also get all that stuff on deathofdeath.net. There's buttons for everything that you need to do Death of Death related. And there's also a huge banner on the homepage for Trevor's GoFundMe. Now, guys, I am super, super happy with where we're at. I'm actually going to check it right now because there's been, a couple $1,000s coming in since the last time I mentioned it, I think. Let me see. I don't have any idea if this is all from my listeners, but we've had, we were around $30,000 last time I mentioned it on the show, and it's over 31,000 now. So like a good 1,000 or more has come in since last week. So if that was you guys, seriously keep it up. Thank you so much. I know, Trevor and Cheryl, thank you. Yeah, so it's just important. Just give a couple of bucks, whatever you can. Doesn't matter. $3 is better than nothing. Yeah, so that's all I got. I've run out of things to say. So, instead of doing my usual sign-off, how would you care for an awkward pause? I'll just, I'm just going to put the microphone away and I'm just going to stare deeply into your eyes.